His topic is one, as you know, I have a background in an interest in Marxist theory. And this is one, as Dr. Kelly will explain, that has languished, as most of Marxist scholarship has for the last 20 years, 30, 40 years. But as people are beginning to debate again, especially in the context of automation and work, but and this is a kind of a predecessor to that debate, the debate about whether, what Marxists should think about automation and work as a predecessor is what you should think about labor in general, what machines do with it, right? So I'll turn it over to Dr. Kelly. Nir is not here today. He's not feeling well. Hopefully he'll be with us in person.
Thanks everybody for inviting me, and thanks for coming. I know this is kind of a stressful time, and so I appreciate you all being here. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to the talk, for the last couple of years I've been teaching a single text senior seminar, which means it's like a group of seniors and we read a book over the course of a semester. And I decided kind of on a whim one year to teach it on Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1. And I don't know why I did that, but I'm glad that I did. It's turned out to be kind of a really interesting experience. And what I'm going to kind of talk to you about today is a series of questions and problems that I've encountered in the text that I've never been able to adequately resolve, and that I think may be of interest to others. And basically the questions that I have encountered have to do with robots. I've been fascinated by the question of what does Marx have to say about the possibility of robots and robot labor. And so the big question that I'm going to kind of be circling around today is just the question of whether or not robots can labor. Is it possible on Marx's account to conceive of robots doing something that is relevantly similar to what humans do in a way that provides the kind of impetus for the economy and for our endeavors? Marx has a straightforward answer to that question in Capital Volume 1, which is no. And so I'm going to be kind of pushing against Marx in a series of places where I think that his analysis is inadequate or kind of underdeveloped or what have you. But the basic question or the basic issue is that I think there's an insight in Marx about the nature of labor that gives us a way of thinking about automation and the possibility of artificial labor in a different way than I've seen done elsewhere. And so I'm going to kind of describe the arguments that Marx makes that I think fail, and then eventually kind of get around to showing the elements of Marx's text that I think are insightful for a more meaningful and a more productive engagement on the question of artificial labor. I'll explain what most of those terms mean. But just to give you a little bit of an introduction, so Karl Marx wrote Capital Volume 1 in 1867. It is his magnum opus. It is this huge book. It's 1,000 pages long in most translations. It is varied. It is, parts of it are straight philosophy. Part of it is history. Part of it is kind of journalistic. Much of it is economic, and he's got equations. It's a very varied text. He's writing it in the aftermath of what's usually referred to as the European Industrial Revolution. Marx witnessed firsthand the rapid changes that occurred in factories, especially in England, during his lifetime, and was quite taken by the rise of machines. The extent to which the way in which people went about making things during his lifetime was completely revolutionized by things like the steam engine, the power mills, various kinds of looms. Everything changed over the course of 50 years, especially in England where he spent this part of his life. And Capital Volume 1 is, I think, best understood as an attempt by Marx to reason through this incredibly traumatic experience that had just happened, that had completely revolutionized industry, but also completely changed society in myriad ways. So that's the book. A note on the text. There are two standard translations of Capital Volume 1 for those of us that can't read it in German. We probably should. There's the Moore and Aveling translation, which was translated in 1906, and then there's the Ben Folks 1976 translation. The Folks translation is the respectable one. It is the one that scholars cite. It's the one that kind of does the best job of reproducing the original German. If any of you actually want to read the book, however, I encourage you to get the Moore and Aveling translation. It's much more lively. Marx is someone who is full of bombast and insults and jokes, and the Moore and Aveling translation does a really good job of rendering that into English. His kind of his jokes and his insults come through very, very clearly in the way that the Folks translation tries to be specific and clear and kind of respectable, and as a result, it doesn't quite have the same appeal. And I do encourage you to try and read the book. It's one of these things that, 1,000-page works of philosophy aren't always all that much fun. This one is. And so if you ever wanted to spend some time reading it, I highly encourage you to. And the Moore and Aveling translation is the way to do it. So I think that the place we need to start is with the concept of value. The concept of value in Marx's Capital Volume 1 is kind of one of the key theoretical concepts that he uses. He begins the book with an analysis of value, and then he eventually connects it to everything of any import in the book. Marx distinguishes between use value and exchange value. This is a distinction that he inherits from the kind of authors that he's engaging with, people like Adam Smith in particular. And the basic idea is that you can think of value in two ways. You can think of it in terms of use value and exchange value. Use value is the value that you derive from consuming a commodity, basically by drinking or eating or in some way using up a commodity. Sometimes you can get value out of it. The example here of something that has a lot of use value is water, right? It gives you all sorts of benefits if you consume it. It quenches your thirst, it makes you healthy, and so on and so forth. That's distinguished from exchange value, which is the value derived from selling or trading a commodity. Water, despite how useful it is to us, is not, in most of its forms, very valuable in exchange. And so if you try and sell me some water, unless it's bottled or unless it's in some kind of fashion that is attractive to me, I'm not going to spend very much on it. And that's, and the contrast is always the diamond. The diamond is something that you can't really consume in any interesting sense, but it has a lot of exchange value. It has the ability to fetch huge prices on markets and things like that. It also has the ability to be traded for a lot of other good things. Marx, throughout the book, tends to focus on exchange value. And so when he talks about value kind of to court without like any modifier, he's usually talking about exchange value. That's not always the case, but we're going to be talking mostly about exchange value. This leads us to the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value, again, is a piece of technical apparatus that Marx inherits from people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Just to step back a bit, Marx at one point in his career describes his intellectual project as being the synthesis of three great traditions. German philosophy, so German idealism, French social theory, this is where he gets his politics, and British political economy. Works of people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and others that today are now associated with classical economic theory. Right? Economics has changed an enormous amount in the intervening time, but Marx gets the labor theory of value from that school of thought. And the labor theory of value is the view of the claim that the exchange of a commodity is, the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. And so basically the idea is that if you want to know how much exchange value something has, you have to look at how much labor time went into producing it. And so it's an answer to the question, what gives a commodity exchange The labor theory of value is definitely one of the most controversial parts of Marx's view, and it's one of the most kind of written about and one of the deepest holes you can fall into in Marx scholarship. And so what I would like to do is to try and find a way to kind of avoid it. But again, the labor theory of value says the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. The reason why it's socially necessary labor time is because you can have inefficient laborers, you can have people who are no good at making stuff, they put a lot of time into it. That doesn't make it more valuable, it actually makes it less. And so the idea is that if you want to know how much exchange value a commodity has, you have to look at that time, on average, how much time is required to make that kind of thing. So Marx adopts the LTV from thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Insofar as there is an argument for the labor theory of value in Capital Volume 1, it's really obscure. Basically, it seems almost as if Marx is just assuming it or just kind of taking it on board because he thinks that everyone that he's going to be engaging with is taking it on board. But insofar as there is an argument for the labor theory of value, it hinges on the idea that there must be a third thing, that is labor, that can explain why two commodities have an equivalent exchange value. And so we often say things like, my laptop and my car are worth the same amount of money. I have a copy. And the question is why? Why does an equivalence hold? Why is it the case that I can say this is worth the same as that? And labor is the answer that was generally given. So this is the answer that Smith gives, this is the answer that Ricardo gives, and this is the answer that Marx gives. Labor is supposed to be the third thing that mediates between exchange and explains why there are certain equivalences that hold between the value of various commodities in a market. In Capital Volume 3, Marx tries to use the labor theory of value to do a number of things. One is to give an account of price, right? So we've been talking about value, which is an interesting kind of way of talking. But the way that people standardly talk about markets is in terms of price. How much do things cost? And Marx in Capital Volume 3 tries to give an analysis of how you get from price, how you get from the value of a commodity, understood as the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it, to an account of its price, and it's a mess. And it's called the transformation problem. How do you transform values into prices? And it basically has led most people who study this to think that Marx, the transformation problem is not soluble as it is presented, and this should be reason enough to reject the labor theory of value. I don't know what to do about this, but what I'm hoping to do is to kind of just flag this as an issue and put it aside so that we can see what else there is in Marx that is of important and of use to us in making sense of questions about automation and maybe even artificial intelligence. But I just want to be transparent that this is a huge problem lurking in the background, and that any kind of complete account of Marx needs to address it to some extent. But I'm going to just leave it aside. This is a quotation from chapter 6 of Capital Volume 1. And it's actually a really good indication of why the Aveling and Moore translation is better. The Aveling and Moore translation renders the key phrase, our friend Moneybags must be so lucky. And this translation, which is the respectable one, calls them the money holder or the money owner, which just doesn't have the same meaning. But this is a description of how markets work. And it's a description of how it is that we can have a capitalist system that is focused around the relationship between capitalists, bosses of various kinds, and workers that do the actual labor. And it is Marx's kind of big reveal of a kind of tension or problem that has been set up at the beginning of the book, and his resolution of a number of important questions. And so I'll just read the quotation. It says, in order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend, the money owner, must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation, on the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption, therefore, is itself an objectification of labor, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity to labor, in other words, labor power. And so what Marx identifies here is that labor power, understood as the selling of one's ability to labor as a commodity. And so this is the sense in which it's a commodity. It's that I want to sell something on the market because I need money. And what I do is I say, listen, I have the ability to labor. I'm going to offer that as a commodity, and someone else is going to buy it. They're going to consume that commodity. They're going to extract use value out of it. And what Marx says is that the consumption of this peculiar commodity, labor power, is a source of value. And so the claim that Marx is making here is that the consumption of the commodity, that is labor power, is a source of value. This is a way of creating more value, a way of creating what we'll call surplus value, which marks human labor power out as being distinctive and unique of all of the commodities that are available in the market. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is highlight this idea of a source of value and try and connect it to some questions about automation and whether or not it's possible for something other than human labor to be a source of value. This is one of my favorite quotations from the book title. Moneybags must be so lucky. So the question that I have is, what can create value? What, he's clearly talking about labor power as being, and laborers as being something that can create value. Is there anything else? Marx treats human labor as unique in its ability to create value. So his answer to all my questions about robots is no. And he's got two explicit arguments for why that's the case. The first argument has to do about animals, and the second argument has to do about machines. I'm going to go through these, but I don't think that they're convincing, and so that's why there's something more to be said, I hope. So the first argument that Marx has is that is the argument that animals cannot create value. This is found in a chapter called The Labor Process and the Valorization Process. Valorization is just the Ben Folks translation of the creation of value. So it's just a fancy technical term for creating value. And so you can read this as the labor process and the creation of value. And in this, Marx, this is, in a 1,000-page book, this is towards the beginning, even though it's almost page 300. And here Marx is giving an account of what he means by labor that's going to stamp it as being uniquely human labor. And he says, labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process which man, through his actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. So Marx understands this in kind of the language of kind of German philosophy as the metabolism between himself and nature. And this is the big claim. We presuppose labor in a form in which it is an exclusively human characteristic. A spider constructs operations which resemble those of the weaver, and the bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. This is the clearest articulation of the claim that I'm going to focus on, which is that humans labor, animals don't. And the reason why they don't, Marx is claiming here, is because labor involves the planning and mental representation of the work prior to its execution. And this is, I take it, what he denies is possible for animals. And so he continues, man not only affects a change in the form of the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purpose in those materials. And so this is an elaboration on this idea of the mental representation precedes the work. It's actually the claim that the mental representation somehow informs and is integrated into the work. And this is supposed to be something that animals cannot do. I don't think this is a convincing. And maybe it works for bees, but it doesn't work for beavers. I just don't think that it's plausible to think that non-human animals don't have what it takes to have these kinds of mental representation. And so my claim is that Marx seems to presuppose rather than argue for the claim that only humans can labor. I think that this is explicit at a couple of times in the text where he's just saying, I'm going to assume that this is the case for it rather than argue for it. I think that it's false to claim that non-human animals don't have mental representations that guide their actions. I think that I cannot imagine that there's any interesting way in which this isn't true of, let's say, primates, apes, for example. And I think it's probably true of beavers. I have no idea about bees. Maybe bees are fundamentally different. But just in terms of evolutionary similarities and various things like that, I can't imagine that beavers don't have the ability to represent and use those representations to guide their actions. So,
do you want to wait till the end for questions?
No, go right ahead.
Because I think the problem's the other way around as well. That labor, Harry Braverman's take on de-skilling and the labor process. The problem's the other way around. Humans create value without when the planning and intelligent piece is taken away from them. And so you can't just say the managers are creating the value. Or wouldn't like to say that.
Good. I mean, I think Marx has something to say to that when we talk about the rate of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And sometimes that might be what's going on. But you're right. This is not a localizable problem. That his claims about the exclusivity of labor, I think, cause problems for him in a number of different places in the book and beyond. And that might be one of them. And so I think that this might be a version of the same question. I just don't understand why conscious purposive activity would be capable of creating values, while unconscious instinctive activities would be incapable of it. So what is it about conscious purposive activity, the integration of purposes into the stuff we do, that makes it special in its ability to create valuable things, whereas non-purposive activity would not? And so I don't think that this is a satisfactory argument. It is explicitly directed at my question. I recognize it, but I just don't think that. I think this is a kind of Marx showing his kind of romantic account of nature, and I just don't think that there's anything here which can do the heavy lifting that he needs in order to show, rather than assume, that labor is uniquely human, or the capacity to do so. So that's the first argument. I don't think it's any good. I'm going to leave this up. The second place where Marx explicitly engages with the question of who can create or what can create value is when he talks about machines. And so one of the core chapters in Capital Volume 1 is a chapter called Machines in Modern Industry, Machinery in Large-Scale Industry in this translation. And it's where Marx kind of gives a history of the rise of machines in factories. And so he talks about how agriculture first was changed by the importation of various kinds of machines. And he talks about the kind of small-scale manufacture, the cottage industries, and the development all the way up to kind of modern large-scale industry, which he associates with the factory. And it's a tale of horrors for Marx, right? The conditions that he's describing are absolutely atrocious. The amount of death and injury is graphically described. He uses this character of Leonard Horner, who is the factory inspector, to give voice to all of these horrors. And so this is kind of one of the goriest and some of the most evocative language in the whole book. I'm going to focus on a set of claims, but just know that this is the way that it's actually rendered in the text is much more affecting than I'm going to present it. And so what he claims here is that machinery, like every other component of constant capital, that just means for Marx, everything other than labor, creates no new value, but yields up its own value to the product it serves to begin. And so the idea here is that other things other than labor can impart value to a new commodity only insofar as they give it up themselves. And so you can use up various kinds of raw materials and things that kind of transfer their value, their socially necessary labor time, to the new commodity. But he's going to claim that they create no new value. They're not sources of value. He says, in the first place, it must be observed that machinery, while always entering as a whole into the labor process, enters only piece by piece into the process of valorization. It never adds any more value than it loses, on average, by depreciation. And so this is an interesting claim. One of the images that he has is value kind of chips off of the machines and goes into the commodities they create a little bit. And that's how you should understand the transfer of value. Machines are expensive things. They have a lot of value because they took a lot of human labor to create. You deploy them in a factory setting, and they can impart their value to the commodities that they produce, but they can create no new value. And this is what is going to distinguish them from human labor. And so he continues, the use of machinery for the exclusive purposes of cheapening the product is limited by the requirement that less labor must be expended in producing the machinery than is displaced by the employment of that machinery. What Marx is claiming here is that the way that machinery is used in factories is to cheapen the thing that you're creating, to make the product less valuable in an interesting sense. And the way that you do that is you ensure that the amount of labor that it takes to make the machine is got to be greater than the amount of labor, is less than the amount of labor that you're displacing, the amount of labor that you're taking away from the production process by employing the machine rather than the people. And so the image, the kind of the backstory that Marx is giving here is kind of complicated, but I think it's interesting. Marx is describing an account of technological diffusion that works kind of like this. An individual capitalist, let's say they're already in an industry, they're making socks. And what they do is they rely upon a lot of human labor in order to make those socks. They decide, listen, I think that if I invest in some machines to make some socks for me, I'll be able to make more money. And the way that that works is they say, I'll invest in these machines, and then I'll lay off my workers, or many of them. And then what I can do is I can pretend like nothing happened. I can put my socks onto the market, and I'll be able to sell them at the same price as everybody else because this amount of socially necessary labor time hasn't changed. But the particular amount of labor time that's required of me has gone down because I'm using fewer workers with more machines, more automation. And if you pull this off, you buy the machines, you lay off the workers, you sell the stuff, and you try and just be quiet about it, in the short run, you can make money. Because what you're doing is you're selling your product as though it has the same amount of value as everybody else's, but in fact it has less, because it has less labor. What happens on Marx's account is inevitable, is that other people get wind of what you're doing, they steal your technology, they deploy it across the whole industry, it diffuses it away, and then what Marx claims is competition between firms leads to the reduction in the value of the commodity and the price of the commodity. And so technology kind of gets loose, everyone starts making the socks in the same way, and lo and behold, what happens is the price of socks falls. And everyone, eventually, that's in the socks business, loses. Because what happens is that you went from a high labor industry to a low labor industry. You were creating high value socks, now you're creating slightly less value socks. And the result is that prices come down accordingly. And so this is the general account, and what it hinges on is the idea that the machines cannot replace labor in the sense that they are not themselves a new source of value. The labor is still unique. It's the only thing that can create more value than it consumes. And so when you substitute in the machine instead of the laborer, you can, in the short run, an individual capitalist can make some money and can kind of keep it going. But as soon as the technology diffuses, it falls apart. This is where my kind of instincts go, robots. What about robots? If instead of talking about the kinds of machines that Marx is talking about, power looms and steam engines and something like that, what happens if we think about robots? If we had, replicants. So if you think, this is what got me thinking, is like if you had replicants from the Blade Runner series, things that look like humans, that act like humans, that think they're humans, they're just not humans, they're actually robots. Why wouldn't they be able to create power? Why wouldn't they be able to do exactly what humans do? Is there something magic about the goo that's inside us and not the goo that's inside them? That doesn't seem plausible. And so my kind of concerns with this argument is that it doesn't seem, at the limit case of something like replicants, to really be able to hold any water. So just to recap, on Marx's account, capitalists introduce machines in order to maximize their own short-term profits. They save on labor costs by shedding workers, but in the end, they end up reducing the value of the commodities they produce. This is, as I was saying earlier, this might be how come profits in the long run tend to decrease, according to Marx, in industries that mechanize, that automate, right? And so in the long run, if you have an industry that is has very low levels of productivity, very low levels of automation, then if you introduce more and more machines, more automation into them, what happens is the price of those commodities will come down, and eventually they'll be less profitable industries than they were at the beginning. This happens, right? Like the reason why socks are cheap is because machines make socks and people don't. If we all had hand knitted socks, they'd be a damn sight more expensive than they are. And so I think there's actually a lot of plausibility in Marx's account, but I'm going to try and resist this, because if Marx's account of the diffusion of technology is accurate and it's applicable to robots, then there's nothing interesting to say. Robots are just another kind of technology, and insofar as they enter an industry, they'll just be a short-term strategy for individual capitalists to make money, but a long-term strategy for lowering costs, lowering price, and kind of reducing profits. Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things that's going on is that Marx imagines that if you sell something, as you already know, if you sell something, then everything that's above the cost of paying the workers in that thing is profit that is going to the capitalist. But actually, the capital investment, in this case, the investment in the machine, is a cost, and the maintenance of those machines is a cost. So in reality, everything involves at least those two components as well, the capital investment and the labor. So
yeah, and that's the case even if it were humans making our socks, right? Because there's still the raw materials, there's still the tables and chairs, there's still the needles and threads. And so, yeah, I'm oversimplifying. If it just is labor and machines, there's always what he calls variable capital, which is labor, and constant capital, which includes everything else. So means of production, the raw materials, the renting of spaces, all of that. And so I am definitely simplifying a lot.
So I haven't read the work of Marx at all. But does Marx's account count for increasing consumption on the demand end? Or does he just think that overall profit will just keep going down and down and down?
So Marx, one of his main concerns is underconsumption. The fact that if you hold markets stable and you have this kind of you introduce technology and automation, you're going to kind of eliminate demand, because you're going to be laying off so many workers, and they're not going to have enough money to buy any of the things. And so it's counterbalanced by the fact that the diffusion of technology through an industry lowers the cost of goods. And so, workers will be able to use their given income more efficiently by buying cheaper commodities. You've got a problem, which is if you're laying off workers and your workers are your consumers, you're going to have underconsumption. And so Marx's claim is that this is why capital is constantly in the search of new markets and expanding, and colonialism and things like this is because it has this tendency to kind of destroy its own internal markets through the laying off of workers because of increasing productivity and increasing automation. So it needs to keep working. And so Marx is really fixated on that question, actually, the way that increases in productivity often lead to the erosion of markets, at least domestically. And that's why he thinks capital needs to constantly be searching for new markets all the time.
So is that kind of like the root of like the Keynesian kind of retort to that, like the focus is more
Prices of
inside the economy?
prices of production, putting money into the economy.
Yeah, I mean, Marx doesn't have the Keynesian set of tools. He doesn't predict that, that governments are going to be intervening in these kinds of ways and that they're going to be able to manage. That what he saw was just these incredible cycles, right, where you have these business cycles that would be these booms in industries, massive investment, and then total collapse of the commodity price. And Marx thought that that instability of this constant up and down was eventually going to ruin the system. That you weren't going to be able to sustain a system, an economic system where you have, booms one day, and then a week later, people have the ability to feed themselves. And so I'm no expert on Keynes, but my understanding of Keynes is an attempt to, through various kinds of policies, to moderate the effects of the fiscal instability and to reduce the business cycle in such a way that it becomes long-term stable, or at least kind of acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, I suggest analytically there's not much difference between the robot and the bee, right? It's not the intelligent planning capacity, it's the relations of production in Marx's terms, right? The property relations, who owns and controls and has property rights and legal rights. So the bee, unless there's beehives everywhere and you get free honey, but labor is adding to that by managing the beehives and bringing the honey to market. And the same way the robots aren't independent people, there's Boston Dynamics here that creates them and sells them to General Motors or whoever, and and brings them into that market relation and sells them as capital. So the bee is like the robot. It's the property rights and relations around it that differentiate it from humans who are selling their labor. And
I mean,
in that sense, you can make the analogy to slavery and robots, and there the economy is different and much more similar to what you're saying.
Good, I agree, and that's where I'm going.
Okay, sorry.
No, but remind me in the question period to talk about slavery, because I don't say anything about it here, but I do think that there's some stuff to be said about it. And so the question that I have about the initial picture is just, would this still happen if robots were able to completely replace work? If they were able to completely force us out of an industry, would it be the case that robots could create value in that kind of situation? Or would it really be the case that the price of those commodities would just fall all the way to the ground? That doesn't seem like it. It seems like there's something else going on that we need a more robust account. And so following David, I think that we need to focus on the way that workers interact with the rest of the economy. And so you kind of stole my thunder, David.
Sorry.
Since part of the value of the machinery is transferred to the product, as long as you've got machinery, the value won't go all the way to the ground.
That's true. It won't go all the way down. It'll always maintain itself at a level that reflects the amount of labor that went into creating the machines, or the machines that created the machines. And so, and maintenance, exactly. And so insofar as there is going to be indirect ways in which labor gets into the production process, then the price of those commodities will still reflect the amount of value that kind of made it in indirectly. And so, but we're talking about real low prices for commodities at that point. And so it's not zero, but extraordinarily low. And as we think about full robotization of various industries, it's not clear to me that that's plausible.
Unless you can, through monopoly, rent seek, and various other techniques.
Intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, which is happening, I think, now. Maybe if you were a Marxist, you would say, well, as a way to ward this off, right? I mean, just he wasn't dealing with those kinds of structures quite yet, but
yeah. And one of the weird things about capital is that he just kind of brackets all that stuff and says, let's imagine that the market's working properly, right? And says, let's just kind of pretend that none of that kind of shady business could be going on. And so he gives, in a way, a really charitable kind of gloss of how markets function, because he says, let's just ignore the possibility of that. But you're right. I think that one thing that could be happening in actual real life is the possibility that there are various kind of shady dealings that are keeping prices propped up in order to avoid the consequences of when you have kind of the bottom falling of commodities because they're fully automated in their production. But I think that we need a better argument. I think that we need something in Marx that is able to actually explain why it is that workers create value and other things don't. And in reading the book, I think that this chapter 6, the sale and purchase of labor power, really is kind of in many ways the most important part of the book. It's the kind of central place that you find some of the key moves. And what he claims in here is that workers are able to create value. They're able to be the source of value because of what he calls their double freedom. So I'll just read again. For the transformation of money into capital, therefore, the owner of money must find the free worker available on the commodity market. And this worker must be free in the double sense that as an individual, he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity. So free to sell their labor power. They can go out on the open market and say, hire me. And this is an important kind of freedom, right? It distinguishes the condition of workers from how they were in feudalism and how they were in slave-holding societies and so on. This is the first sense of freedom. And on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale. That is, he is rid of them. He is free of all of the objects needed for the realization of his labor power. This is Marx being ironic. Right? This is Marx saying the second sense in which they're free is that they have no choice. Right? They must sell their labor on the labor market because they have no other way of making a living. This is what it means to be a wage laborer for Marx. It means that you are in a position where you have no master or lord, or you have no one to whom you are beholden. You can sell your labor on the market, but you have to sell it to someone, otherwise you will starve. And that, or you will starve thing, is the second sense of the double freedom. And what Marx is claiming is that that is what is special about human labor, at least in capitalist societies, is that workers are like that. They have this kind of, they're pulled in two directions. On the one hand, they're pulled in the direction of having choice and being able to make decisions for themselves about who they sell their labor to. And on the other side, they're compelled and they're unfree. They're required to sell it to someone. And that's what I think we should focus on if we want an account of the possibility of artificial labor. This is kind of the strategy that I'll deploy for how we can think about the possibility of machines laboring. If I see what I mean. So my claim is that in order to create value, machines would need to, 1, be sufficiently independent of capital to be a source of value, and 2, be sufficiently dependent on capital to be controlled by it. This is just kind of taking this same sense of double freedom and saying, let's apply it to machines. And that, I take it, is going to be the recipe for how you could create artificial labor on Marxist account. And so, just to kind of walk us through this, how do free workers create value, free in this double sense? Marx says, this is a move that he makes throughout the book, which is just to say, well, if you look at it one way, you can't really make any progress. If you look at it at the level of individuals, it seems hopeless. You'll never be able to identify how workers create value. But the matter takes quite another aspect when we contemplate not the single capitalist and the single laborer, but the capitalist class and the laboring class. Not an isolated process of production, but the capitalist production in full swing on its actual social scale. And so he says, if we move to the analysis of classes, if we move to things in kind of its full sweep, then we'll be able to see how this is possible. He claims, the maintenance and reproduction of the working class is and must ever be a necessary condition on the reproduction of capital. But the capitalist may safely leave its fulfillment to the laborer's instincts of self-preservation and propagation. This is the sense in which there's a kind of independence of the worker and capital. The capitalist hands a check to the worker and says, you figure it out, right? You go buy the stuff you need, you buy your food, you find some housing, you figure it out and just show up tomorrow and we'll do this again. And that's what distinguishes capitalism in large extent from previous modes of production. Feudalism had a kind of bond between the serf and the lord. Slavery had chains that bound them. But what's happened on Marx's account when you move to capitalism is that the capitalist gets kind of an interesting arrangement where they hire people, pay them a wage, and then can forget about it and don't need to worry about tending to their various kinds of needs. And as a result, they're independent of capitalists in an important sense. And just to elaborate, he says, the Roman slave was held by chains. The wage laborer is bound to his owner by invisible threads. The appearance of independence is maintained by a constant change in the person of the individual employer and the legal fiction of a contract. And so Marx says, you know, what really happens here is that there's a power relation built into the structure of the economy, which gives the capitalist the ability to control the worker and then to kind of set the worker free at the end of the day, whereupon the worker does all of the remaining work that needs to be done in order to keep them alive for another day of work. And this is maintained by the legal fiction that the worker and the capitalist are kind of on an even playing field. They're legal equals in terms of their contract, even though there's this enormous power disparity. This, I take it, is the key to how workers create value. And the answer to the question, well, why can't machines create value, I think, is because machines aren't like this. Machines are entirely dependent upon capital in the wrong kind of way. If we wanted machines to be able to create value, they would have to have this double freedom. They would need to be independent enough of capital so that machines would go out and do all the things that they need to do in order to survive and to show up again for the next day of working. But they also need to be available at the whim of capital. If they satisfy those two conditions, they can create value. If they don't, they're just machines. They're just the kinds of things that we've been dealing with all along. I think that this is interesting, and if it's true, then it gives us some things to think about the future of artificial intelligence. The idea that the future of artificial intelligence might be the design of systems that have this kind of double freedom, right? Where they have an independence so that they're not responsive to their masters or their employers to kind of tend to their every need and desire, but they are somehow beholden enough to capital to be able to do the things that are demanded of them. I'm thinking here not about robots in a kind of physical sense, but artificial intelligence of a kind of large enough scale where you can imagine it being no longer tethered to kind of, you know, some companies maintaining it, so all of its needs and desires on some mainframe, but instead being liberated enough to be able to tend to its own needs and desires, but somehow still at the beck and call of the capitalists. So I said I would talk about AI, and so I will. This quotation, the maintenance reproduction of the working class is and must ever be the necessary condition for the reproduction of capital, but the capitalist may safely leave its fulfillment to the laborer's instincts for self-propagation and preservation. Marx is clear that automation and by extension artificial intelligence clearly poses a threat to workers, right? It's a gory, violent story of how the shedding of workers from industries where you have automation leaves them to starve and to be exploited in various awful ways. The question is whether the threat, this threat, is different in kind from previous waves of automation. Is it possible that artificial intelligence, as opposed to just being another machine that transforms an industry and lowers the overall rate of profit in that industry, could it be instead that artificial intelligence could be a new and independent source of value? If they were, I think that would be perhaps a threat. They would be a challenge to human labor in a way that was different in kind from what we have seen previously. But in order for artificial intelligence to resist the standard dynamics of technology diffusion, it would in some way have to become independent of capital. And this is where I want you to think about ways in which artificial intelligence could become separated from the people who create them and who use them in a way that they kind of roam free in some realm. This is exactly, by the way, what kind of alarmists about AI want us not to do, right? People like Nick Bostrom want us to curtail and hem in artificial intelligence to as much extent possible, because he thinks that they will be potentially malicious and harmful to humans. But if I'm right, then what you should expect is pressure on the part of people who developed artificial intelligence to let them go and say, artificial intelligence, you go fend for yourself, for your self-preservation and propagation. Just show up when we need you to solve a problem. And that would be a step in the direction of them becoming sources of value. And so in order for artificial intelligence to be a source of value, it would need to be motivated to respond to the demands of capital. And so you need to have the stick. There has to be some way that you can actually get something that has a degree of independence to work for you. In the case of human workers, that is the fact that human workers don't have access to the means of production, so they're forced to work for capitalists because they would starve otherwise. Who knows what it would be for artificial intelligence. I'm running out of time, so I'm going fast, but I just want to, this might seem all kind of outlandish. How can we imagine that capitalists could, in a deliberate way, create workers of a certain kind that have this double freedom? And so, you know, is it really feasible to think that we could create artificial laborers? And I'll just point out that Marx thinks that there's precedent for this. He doesn't think that the existence of workers as the capitalist finds them on the market is natural. This was the result of a long and vicious process that he calls primitive accumulation. And so one of the last chapters of the book is called The Secret of Primitive Accumulation, and it's the story of how workers came to be. The process, therefore, which creates the capital relation can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. This is the bad kind of freedom. It is a process which operates two transformations, whereby the social means of subsistence and production are turned into capital, and the immediate producers are turned into wage laborers. So-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. So Marx finishes the book by saying, workers as we find them in this double freedom aren't natural. They were created over a long and agonizing process. And so there's precedent, I think, for the idea that we could create workers that are capable of being sources of value, like maybe we could do in a lab at some point. So this has been kind of pessimistic. I just want to kind of flag at the end that Marx, however, is not a pessimist about technology. Marx was convinced that the many contradictions internal to capitalism, for example, as someone was asking about the fact that automation leads to underconsumption, would soon lead to revolution and to its being replaced by communism. And so he thought this was all going to get better. The transition to a post-capitalist system of production represents for Marx a shift away from an economy based on exchange values to one centered on use values. And so one of the things that he thinks will be different about communism is that it won't be based on the creation and exchanging things anymore. It'll be focused on creating things that satisfy human needs without the need of kind of going through exchange and all of the difficulties inequalities that arise therefrom. So for these reasons, Marx sees machines as a threat to workers in the short term, but ultimately machines and the things they produce are to be part of the liberation of humanity from the bonds of servitude. So this is why I think for Marx, the possibility of artificial labor and the possibility that there could be, machines that could do everything that humans could do is not necessarily a cause for alarm. Once the revolution happens, he thinks, then what we would have is new comrades, right? We would have our artificial comrades that help create use values and satisfy human need and work alongside us. It's a very different picture from what I've been thinking about, but it's important to realize that Marx's account tends towards that optimistic reading in a way that I don't. That's all I have.
Cool. You had an addendum about slavery that you wanted to make.
Right, and so one thing just to note is that Marx thinks that there are forms of work that happen before capital, and that the relationships that obtain there are structurally similar, in that you have an oppressive class and then you have the oppressed class. But one of the things that distinguishes capitalist from pre-capitalist societies is the degree of independence. And so there's a kind of a genetic story that Marx gives, where you start with a situation in which workers are almost indistinguishable from animals in the way that they're treated in slaveholding societies, insofar that you treat humans as property in the way that you treat animals like property, and that they slowly over time, the amount of freedom through these constant revolutions changes that, and you have increased freedom of one kind that leads to increased capacity to be a source of value, but always with the caveat that the workers must be available at the whim of capital.
And I'll take the prerogative to make one comment before I turn it over to you guys. And that is just that the economist Robin Hanson at George Mason, who's not at all a Marxist, the opposite, but he's argued that the fastest route to artificial intelligence will be copying human brains and reproducing human skills through this kind of process. I think it's a lot more easy to imagine that in that context you could have, you could treat those workers like independent contractors than the existing robots in artificial intelligence.
And I really do think that there's something plausible to that, coming up with a general purpose artificial intelligence is going to be enormously costly, and maintaining it in existence and kind of doing all the things you need to kind of keep it going is going to be extraordinarily burdensome for an individual firm, let's say. And there's going to be so much pressure as a result on that firm to lend it out and to ask you, so we're not using the AI right now. We need someone else to use it so we can charge them back. And the tendency is, I think, going to be towards the development of artificial intelligence in a way that allows the people who employ it to gain as much independence from it as they can. And that's what I think is the insight that's interesting about Marx's kind of double freedom, is that that's how he characterized workers. And it's also something that he recognized as being a historical product, something that was maybe not done intentionally in the sense that it was what individual people were thinking, but as the result of kind of the complicated interaction of many people working over a long period of time.
But could that independence also just be state ownership? So you like say, okay, I mean, like you little bit like you have like food stamps can drive down the salaries of people at home. You could have like AI, not at all independent in any cognitive sense, supported, shared in that sense. So like the independence you talk about is from capital could very easily be separated from any kind of creature independence.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably what Marx would assume about the way that something like, artificial intelligence would function in a post-capitalist communist society. Marx is is a technophile in the sense that he thinks that in order to maintain the levels of production that will be necessary to maintain a communist society functioning, you're going to need huge amounts of automation. You're going to need, and so the question that I think you raise is, well, where and how would artificial intelligence be kind of housed and supported and reside? State ownership of the mines, mills, and factories, maybe state ownership of artificial intelligence as well.
But there's a difference between state ownership and state support. So in the reason why I'm using the food stamps, right, is that you still have, so it's like you could do gig economy, right, where the supports of the needs of the worker is financed through state means. However, the ownership of the products, etc., is actually within capital, which would, like, as far as I could see, maximize the capital and still like gain the independence. But you don't have either state ownership actually, or the AI being independent in any Nick Bostrom sense.
Yeah, and so if it was possible to thread the needle in that way, then you might get to have it both ways.
I don't know if I wanted those ways. I just think that would be a likely result, given that AI, the way that it functions now, is completely not singularity, right? It's not taking care of its own needs at all, and it's completely piggybacking on the data of human beings and the labor of human beings, and its value is constantly fed by that data stream.
Yeah, and so again, part of the hard thing for me in kind of imagining how this will deploy is just I don't know what kind of dependence would make sense for something like an artificial intelligence. What would it mean for an artificial intelligence to be independent? What would it mean for it to be free in the kind of robust sense? The way that I tend to kind of default is just to think about in terms of where it's housed and who supports it, and how does it get the things that it needs to keep itself in existence. And I've always just assumed that that's a matter of kind of like letting it go. But maybe you're right. Maybe it actually is a matter instead of having the state intervene in some way and keeping it tended to, while not kind of directly changing the way that it interacts with its those who employ it. That's really interesting. Thank you.
That's a sort of question. I'm sorry, I'm kind of trying to think of how to phrase this as I go. But it seems to me that when you're talking about Marx, you're things like labor or even capital, or fundamentally it's about social relationships between people. Correct? Like labor is at its heart a social relationship between the capitalist and the labor that gets turned into an exchange relationship. And capital itself is something like that too. So I guess if you buy that idea, if we can imagine this sort of edge case that you say, where the capitalist can essentially produce without any sort of relationship with the worker, like it's machines that are doing all of the production, there's no social relationship there. It's purely the relationship between the capitalist and the machinery. What does that mean for the Marxist conception of labor, or the Marxist conception of capital? Do they become outdated terms in this scenario? Do we need to redefine capital?
I don't think so. I mean, Marx will worry about the consequences of this kind of effect. But at the end of the day, what he will point out is that you still will have these classes. You will have people who cannot live but by laboring, and you will have those who own the things that we labor upon. The difference is just that one of those groups is going to starve. And so I think that the Marxist analysis still holds water. It's just that now we have an increasingly difficult problem, which is that there's decreasing incentives on the capitalist class to employ workers, even though they still have the kind of second sense of freedom, in that if they aren't employed, they will starve. And so Marx, I think that the possibility that you could have the complete erosion of labor power throughout huge numbers of industries is a huge problem. But I don't think it's one that motivates us to kind of like say, well, you need to start over with new conceptual categories. It's just that this is actually the result of a very long process that Marx, even in his early stage, thought he could see his way to. Right? Marx was already in the 1800s talking about the possibility that labor would be redundant and kind of expendable. In some ways, the thing you kind of walk away from reading the book is, why did it take so long? Because he saw it happening much faster in a way than it actually has. And Marx's optimism is that this will be the trigger for revolution. And once the revolution happens, you abolish the classes, you centralize all of the resources, and then you deploy all of the technology to directly serve the needs and wants of people. And so once you eliminate class, then all of the technology is for the good.
I don't really understand why this necessarily leads to like a communal society instead of just like a universal system of differential private ownership. Like if we are able to keep making labor more and more and more productive, then people will be able to build up some bit of their own capital, and you might still have class and classes, but not have labor, like, and still have people be okay with that. Like, it's like, I look at like even people who aren't part of the upper class, but are still able to generate income off of capital. So I don't really understand why this necessarily, in his conception, leads to a communal society and not just differential private ownership of capital across the whole society.
Good. Marx's view is that what will occur is that there will be such huge inequality of various kinds, such massive disruptions, that there will be a kind of violent overthrow of capital. And the kind of background claim is that we have at our fingertips the resources we need in order to live in a time of total abundance. We can make anything we need, as long as we restructure class relations in such a way that they're no longer oppressive. And what that means for him is to eliminate classes. And that's why he thinks you're not just going to change the relations of capital and workers, you're going to destroy the capitalist class. But you're right that even in the face of abundance, you could imagine there being the continuation of hierarchy. It would just have to be a radically different form. There's a really great article or book, depending on which length you want to read, called Four Futures by Peter Frase, F-R-A-S-E, in which he identifies 4 ways that you could imagine the future going. It has to do with, do you preserve hierarchy and do you have abundance? And one of them is rentism, which I think captures what you're worried about, or what you identify as the possibility that even if we had the technology we need to satisfy all of our needs effortlessly, you can still come up with ways in which you could preserve hierarchy by various kinds of intellectual property or various kinds of social status. And I think that it's a really interesting kind of insight. It's not one that I see in Marx. One of the like super peculiar things is that Marx is associated as being like the philosopher of communism, but he wrote this enormous tome about capital, and he writes very little ever about communism. It orients his thinking clearly, but he doesn't spend his time writing about it as much as one might expect.
This what you just said kind of made me think a little about like some of these kind of like how Marx is remembered versus kind of like, you know, how he actually behaved like in his work and that kind of thing. And this isn't a question necessarily related to AI, but more, I I guess, a history question. So, the class I took last semester, we learned a little bit about Marx, and he had like this great friendship with some other Prussian guy who he met in England. But long story short, the bulk of the relationship was built off Marx being like the brain power, and this other guy, he's like Angle. Him being like the charismatic buddy guy that would like get him all these relationships. And early on in your talk, you talked about like how one translation has like his humor in it. But so that kind of confused me because I was like, wait, I thought he wasn't like a funny guy. So
just to go back, if you
More
look at the,
acerbic than funny. But
if you look at the cover of the translation that I encourage, edited by Friedrich Engels, and so it is Engels. Engels is often kind of maligned as being merely the person who bankrolled Marx. For complicated reasons, Marx never had an academic position, and so probably due to his politics. But he had to support himself throughout his life in various kinds of ways. He was a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. He wrote for newspapers. And it wasn't until he met Engels, who is the son of a wealthy industrial capitalist, that he was able to actually kind of stabilize his finances in a way that allowed him to write, for example, Capital. I don't think it's fair just to think of Engels as being just the bankroller. Engels wrote a very famous book on the origins of the English working class. He's a historian of kind of, a respected historian in a way that Marx is not a respected historian. But it is true that their partnership, they both co-wrote the Communist Manifesto and a number of other important works. Their relationship does have this weird power imbalance in that Marx is dependent upon Engels, especially towards the end of his life, for his financial security. That said, I think that Engels was the mover and shaker who managed to kind of get contracts, and there's all sorts of funny anecdotes about. There's a letter from the publisher of Capital, basically berating Marx for being late with the manuscript and saying, if you don't get it to us by the end of the year, we're going to find someone else to write Capital. That's not how it works, unfortunately. And so, I don't remember why I made that.
Engels must have come in somewhere.
Yeah, Engels was very good at helping Marx kind of make connections and things like that. But I don't think it's fair to say that that's all he did. And clearly, the acerbic kind of wit and the writing ability that you see in Capital Volume 1 is Marx's. And part of it is because he shows you his capacities as a journalistic writer. In those long sections where he's documenting the horrors of the working class in England. That shows Marx his strengths as a writer in a really clear way.
that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, just a couple of thoughts, really provocative, maybe. Sci-fi has this theme of AI becoming autonomous, from HAL in 2001 to Westworld, which has a lot of these themes, right, about rebelling against oppression, and as the robots realize they're being oppressed, so Westworld, great series if you haven't watched it yet. But there is some work in this area about say platform technologies like Uber and how they can operate in a hyper-capitalist mode. But Juliet Shaw at BC has been doing some work, what would it look like if they're controlled by taxi collectives, or the same technology can be operated in a different set of relations and look very different.
One of the most interesting examples of that is unions getting hold of these kinds of open source technologies and using them to kind of increase the number of people that are in the union and support them in various ways. And it's true that if you can get these tools into the hands of people with a different agenda, then I think it's possible for them to do real good. On the first question about kind of platforms, that's really, I think, that what I'm most kind of confused about and trying to understand is, how do we understand this narrative that you get from from sci-fi about the robots that are overthrowing the overlords, and kind of make it more compatible with the kind of picture that I've given here, and kind of strip it of its kind of hyperbole and everything else. I do think that that's one of the reasons why I began to think of this. I can a bunch of sci-fi that I've read about, you know, the way that artificial intelligence rebels against its human oppressors. But I do think that there's something beyond just kind of the narrative appeal of it. I think that there's something important to be said about the conditions under which we could see artificial intelligence genuinely rivaling human labor. And I think that Marx can give us some hints about how that might take place.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.